Hello, this is Tim Collins coming to you again with our weekend word. Let me just tell you a little story from my childhood. If you've read my bio on the website, you know that I was called to preach before I was born. I just preached all my life. And when I was, young, I mean 3, 4, 5 years old, I would walk next door, which for me was a trail more than half a mile through the woods to our next door neighbors. Brother Lee and Sister Opie Woods were their names. Just precious people, a little bit older than my parents, and my parents were old enough to be my grandparents, so they were like grandparents to me. And so I would go over there several days a week. I'd go in and just hang out with Sister Opie, and I would preach to her. She'd set me up a little pulpit and put up a sign, and I would preach to her, and she would get saved almost every day. You know, I'd see that hand. And I was quite an effective evangelist back in the day. But Brother Woods, he was one of those strange people that felt like that the Bible said exactly what God intended for it to say, and wasn't confusing. It just, you believed what it said, and to that extent, he believed that if he got sick, God would heal him. He refused to go to a doctor. Never went to a doctor in his entire life until he was 87 years old. Had never went to a doctor. He was unconscious when they hauled him off to the doctor when he was 87. At any rate, never took an aspirin to my knowledge. He prayed. And you know, his attitude was, either God will heal me or I'll go on to heaven, and either way was fine with Lee Wood. Well, there came a day when Brother Lee was sick with pneumonia, terribly sick, bedridden for days on end, getting worse and worse, could barely breathe. It really looked grim. Called, various preachers, pastors would go over and pray with him. Friends would go over and pray with him. He prayed. It just didn't seem, he just got worse and worse. But in prayer, Brother Lee heard from God. God was moved on him to have me, little 4-year-old Tim Collins, preacher man, come pray for him. He sent his wife to get me. They didn't have a telephone. She walked that half-mile trail through the woods, explained what she was there for. I followed her over there. Now, I remember this, and of course the details have been filled in down through the years by my dad and other people, but I remember walking with Sister Opie through the woods, walking in there, demanding some sort of oil. She got something, olive oil or something, out of the cabinet, and anointed him with oil, prayed for him, and by the end of the day, he was up out of bed. By the next day, he was fully recovered. Was it me laying hands on him that made him recover? I don't think so. I really believe that Lee Wood's obedience to the voice of God was what brought about his healing. You know, it was humbling. He had had other pastors come and pray for him. He had prayed for himself. He was a lay preacher himself. It had to be humbling to send for a 4-year-old preacher to come and pray for him. But he obeyed God. He did what God moved on him to do, and God healed him. See, I believe that obedience moves the hand of God. More than anything you can do, obedience moves the hand of God. Faith is demonstrated in obedience. When we're not willing to obey God, it's hard to say we believe what God said. Anyway, obedience moves the hand of God. Too many times, we would rather substitute other things for obedience, because we just don't want to, or don't feel like, or just can't bring it in ourselves to do what God said. We'll do something. We'll write a check rather than doing what God told us to do. God calls us to go to Africa to spend our lives there. We'll write a check and send somebody else. You know, obedience moves the hand of God. You can't write a check big enough to impress God. He paves streets with gold. God doesn't care how big a check you write. Now, He cares how much is left after you write. On the other hand, if obedience moves the hand of God, disobedience, a refusal to obey God, brings about the wrath of God. God doesn't like it when people rebel against His instructions. And the Bible says that rebellion is addictive. I believe that's my take on it. God sent Saul, the king of Israel, to be His judgment upon the Amalekites. Saul was told to wipe out every living thing. Every human being, man, woman, and child was to be slaughtered. Even their livestock was to be slaughtered. Leave no trace of the Amalekites in the land, God told Saul. Saul went off, and a little later God told Samuel, the prophet, Samuel, you need to go check on Saul. He's been disobedient. Samuel accosted Saul on the track home. Saul said, well, you know, I did kill everybody, but I saved the king, kind of a professional courtesy. I saved the king of the Amalekites. And the people brought back some of the cattle and are going to sacrifice the nicest ones to God. And Samuel replied in 1 Samuel 12:22, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the voice of God? To obey is better than sacrifice. To heed is better than the fat of rams. Divination and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. Now the word divination, witchcraft in some versions, is the Greek word pharmakeia, which means drugs, or, you know, the Greek same root that we get pharmacy and pharmaceuticals from. Pharmakeia, drugs. Hallucinogens and other drugs have been used throughout history and still today in the practice of witchcraft. And so, you know, I kind of read into that, and this is just my take on it, but I kind of read into that. Rebellion is addictive. When we get used to disobeying God, we think nothing then of disobeying God. We think nothing of carrying it even further and just being outright rebellion against God, and that brings the wrath of God. Be obedient, don't be rebellious. That's the story. By the way, the rest of Lee Wood's story. When he was 87 years old, he collapsed at home. They called an ambulance, hauled him off to the hospital. For the first time in his life, he was seen by a doctor, was in a hospital as a patient for the first time in his life, was given medication for the first time in his life, and within a couple of days had died. That's the rest of his story. Well, I hope you'll be in church somewhere Sunday, worshiping God in spirit and in truth. God bless you. We love you.